So welcome to the 7 principles of the U.S. Constitution. This is kind of a fast walkthrough. And again, I tried to make this PowerPoint kind of nice and quick of kind of the principles behind why we structured the Constitution the way in which we did. So the first principle with the U.S. Constitution and with governments in general seems to be limited government. Before everything else, you at least want to have this idea that the government needs to have its power limited in certain ways. And we may disagree on where government should be limited in its power, but ultimately its power does need to have limits. And so virtually everyone agrees upon that the government must have limits. And so ultimately we go back to, there's this quote from Lord Acton, as he's called. You could probably insert a British accent there, as you say Lord Acton. But power corrupts, and absolute power corrupts absolutely. And so a lot of our movies today that we have, a lot of old stories, they have these stories where, again, it's about there's some way that power is symbolized, and there's some way that even the best characters in the story are slowly corrupted by that power, and they have to fight against it to kind of break that power up. So obviously one of these big ones is Lord of the Rings. And so again, it's a little hard for you guys to appreciate how big this was about 10, 15 years ago, but absolutely huge, and the books were even bigger. Obviously, you guys have Thanos and the Infinity Stones. And so we've talked this one to death, but again, Thanos is assembling all the power, and that's never a good thing. And so the first time that we began to limit the power of government would obviously go back to the year 1215 with the document that we know of as the Magna Carta. Now, if you're a British person, you probably just say Magna Carta. You don't put the "the" there, you just say Magna Carta. All our copies of the Magna Carta are very old, and we believe that the original copy was destroyed, that it kind of died a long time ago. But the ones that were produced very close to that original copy, occasionally you will see them being sold. I think it was 2007, one went up for auction, and ultimately the one that was up for auction in 2007 sold for $21.3 million. And so the Magna Carta began this limiting of the power of the king. We see this again whenever we structure our own constitution, and the anti-federalists such as Patrick Henry and George Mason talk about how they're afraid that this new government we're creating has just too much. And so again, we then come up with the Bill of Rights to try to make sure that it's limited. So federalism is the next principle. So federalism involves the distribution of power between the national, central, federal level. Again, those are about the three terms that you could use to describe it. The national, central, and federal. And the state governments on the other side. And so, again, kind of it's the nation versus the state, the federal versus the state. And so we have certain powers that we give exclusively to the national government. And then we have other powers that we give exclusively to the state government. And in between, as you can see from this Venn diagram, we have these shared powers. Now, both governments can collect taxes on you. We live in a state, the state of Texas, where you do not have to pay income tax to the state of Texas. Where we have to pay taxes in Texas is on property tax. And so some of that's it can be a little heavy at times, is how it feels for us. But we don't pay state income tax. Other states like California, they pay state income tax and they pay federal income tax. So there are some shared powers here. And so again, you can see that both can punish criminals, both can borrow money and regulate banks. The national power is mostly concerned with the military, declaring war, things that the states can't do. The states, meanwhile, basically setting up schools became a big 10th Amendment right issue. And so about half the state budget each and every year is devoted purely to the Texas school system. And so it's part of why you will see education debated quite a bit in Austin. But again, state powers are those given exclusively to the state. And so again, here we can see kind of an example of state powers. You're looking at the map. take a moment and look at it, again, what you can see is this is the way that each state has decided to kind of regulate their speed limits. And again, we're in Texas, and you can read the one on Texas down there. We like the ability to drive fast. So there are some spots out and around Austin where you can find like 80, 85 mile an hour driving areas in Texas. But okay, by and large, you do see that we reduce speed limits for both safety and gas efficiency. But in Texas, we are a little more open to driving faster than many other states. So again, here you can see this is a cartoon relating the idea that if you accept federal money on certain things, with it often comes federal authority. You might want their money, but do you really want to be giving them authority? Another one that's extremely easy is popular sovereignty. Popular means people. It's the same word that's at the root of population. So popular is people, and sovereignty is just a big word for power. And so this phrase, we the people, this is again a good description of popular sovereignty. And so most fundamentally, this is exercised when people vote. This is one of the clearest, easiest demonstrations of popular sovereignty, that people are using their power to elect those who will represent them in government. So again, more kind of cartoons related to voting with popular sovereignty. Okay, pretty good message here. We have a lot of Americans who don't bother to go out and vote. And I will say it's a little more complicated than maybe some people make it out to be. It's not just you walk in and you look at the presidential thing. You're going to get in there and they're going to give you all kinds of the railroad commissioner, the local school board. I mean, you're just going to get all kinds of strange, elections that maybe you're not as aware of. And you may not be as aware of the candidates. And so that has some people they vote straight Republican or straight Democrat on their ticket. Or you can again choose one by one, but a lot of people are there for the presidential race, or they'll vote for particular Senate offices or House of Representatives. But then when all the other smaller offices are there, they may not be as aware on those issues. Checks and balances. Ideally, I would have put the checks and balances after the separation of powers. But checks and balances means that once we've separated the powers, we've distributed them, broken them away, so that we have three different branches in charge of different aspects of the government. Checks and balances means that they can put each other in check, prevent each other from gaining too much power. So obviously we're in the middle of kind of the Trump impeachment process, and we don't really know where that's going to go. We don't know if he will be impeached. We don't know if he will be removed. And so, but this is an example of the legislative branch, okay, putting the executive branch, the presidency, in check. And so, meanwhile, the president has the ability to check the legislative branch. We watched recently as there was the Hong Kong Rights Bill, and it got passed by Congress and the legislative branch, and it went over to the executive branch, where China told President Trump that he should veto it. Trump did not veto it, he approved it. But that would have been a check on the legislative branch. Okay, Republicanism is not about the Republican Party. Republicanism comes from the fact that we live in a republic. I'm going to state that again. We live in a republic. We do not live in a democracy. And so you will hear the word democracy thrown about all the time about the United States. Okay, but technically we're not a democracy, we are a republic. Well, what's the difference? Okay, it's not very complicated. A democracy, a true democracy, would often involve you voting in every single governmental thing. It would mean that every American votes in their government. And with 328 million Americans, you just can't do that. We can't all march to D.C. all the time, cast our votes, and then keep things going that way. It's not efficient. So we elect someone to represent us. You guys will get to elect 2 state senators. You'll get to elect 1 president. You'll get to vote for your representative in the U.S. House. You'll get to vote for your representatives and senators in the Texas Congress. And so that's what republicanism is. Not about the Republican Party. It's about you voting someone to represent you. Okay, separation of powers is, again, just one of the basics. In order to make sure that a government is limited in its power, we need to take what power it has and separate it out, distribute it out, put checks and balances on it. And so most governments today, if you look around the world, they do have 3 branches, just like we do. Now, I've seen a couple where they might have 4 branches, and I'm a little suspect on which ones those are. You might want to look that up as a pure curiosity. But the legislative branch makes the laws. Legislative, L, laws. The executive branch enforces the laws. E, executive, E, enforces. And so the executive branch is the military, it's the police. The president is at the head of all those things. Meanwhile, the judicial branch interprets the laws. So that's how we separate the power within the United States. And finally, something that we don't need to spend a ton of time with, because we've done so already in class, is individual rights. And again, the first time that individual rights show up for us comes within the context of basically John Locke giving Thomas Jefferson this idea about unalienable rights, that you have the right to life, liberty, and property. As we know, Jefferson changed that to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Okay, but from there, we then get back into this debate as the Constitution's coming forth between a group of people known as the Federalists and a group known as the Anti-Federalists. And it's the Anti-Federalists who insist that the new Constitution needs a Bill of Rights specifying the rights that you have against a federal government to ensure that it's not too powerful. And so, again, those 10 rights that we come up with, 12 were proposed, 10 were ultimately accepted, and so here's the 10 that we have inherited. Again, First and Second Amendment, pretty easy to remember. Okay, Third Amendment, also, I would say fairly easy to remember. It's 4, 5, 6, 7, and kind of 8 in here where you're going to get a little fuzzy. And so these are the ones that you really need to study. 10 with the state, it's pretty easy. 9 isn't completely easy, but again, that might be one of the smartest amendments. Okay, rights that they haven't previously declared. So, again, thank you for listening, watching. Make sure you complete the video and all of its questions.